The Ottoman Empire loved to project power, but behind the palace walls, something far darker was unfolding, and one brutal night proved it. Sultan Ibrahim I, consumed by jealousy and suspicion, snapped. Dozens of concubines were dragged out and thrown into the freezing palace fountain. No ceremony, no mercy, just soaked silk, silent terror, and bodies vanishing under the icy water. People call this a rumor. It isn't. It's recorded in diplomats' letters, whispered memories, and censored accounts that somehow survived. Behind the polished image of a mighty empire, there existed a system where luxury became a trap and silk often meant a sentence. To the outside world, the Ottomans ruled continents, built soaring mosques, and filled markets with gold and spices. But inside the Topkapi Palace, desire, politics, and fear interacted like a weapon. The harem wasn't some fantasy garden, it was a highly controlled power machine where survival depended on alliances, manipulation, and luck. It looked like paradise, it functioned like a gilded prison. And to understand how this hidden world became a cornerstone of imperial power, we have to trace its roots. Before diving deeper into these buried stories of ambition and suffering, hit like and subscribe if you love uncovering history's darkest truths, and tell me where you're watching from. The real maze of blood and silk began long before that infamous night. In 1453, Mehmed II, the Conqueror, captured Constantinople. A city of domes and Byzantine mosaics became the beating heart of a new Islamic empire stretching from the Balkans to Arabia. And inside this conquered palace, an institution emerged that would shape the dynasty for generations. The harem wasn't built to entertain the sultan, it was crafted to protect the throne. Every woman brought inside, whether the daughter of a noble captured in war or a slave purchased from Crimea, the Caucasus, or the Balkans, lost her real name at the gates. She was given a new identity, often in Persian, Arabic, or Turkish. Her past was erased. Her future became a gamble. Among all these women, one title towered above the rest: Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. She wasn't just a caretaker. She was the harem's ruler and one of the most powerful figures in the entire empire. During the era known as the Sultanate of Women, influential figures like Hurrem Sultan and Kursem Sultan proved that a concubine could rise to become the empire's shadow ruler. But that power came at a brutal price. To rise, a concubine needed a son, and she needed to keep both herself and that child alive long enough for him to ascend the throne. Every pregnancy turned into a battlefield. Every cradle became a political weapon. And once princes reached adolescence, the tension exploded. Brothers became rivals. Mothers became enemies. Quiet hallways became war zones. Topkapi, with its marble courtyards and golden latticework, wasn't just a palace, it was a fortress where every step was watched. Black eunuchs from sub-Saharan Africa, mutilated in childhood, served as the harem's gatekeepers. They lived solely to enforce the rules and guard its secrets. Over time, men like the chief black eunuch, the Kursla Angsha, held enormous influence, becoming the bridge between the harem and the empire's highest offices. Meanwhile, the city outside pulsed with rumors. In the Grand Bazaar, people spoke in hushed voices about forbidden affairs, mysterious deaths, and hidden betrayals inside the palace. For ordinary citizens, the harem blended fascination and fear. For European diplomats, it became an obsession, exotic, scandalous, and carefully documented in letters sent to capitals across Europe. But beneath all the myth-making, the truth was simple. The harem controlled the empire's future. A single birth or death could determine who ruled millions. A concubine's silence, a eunuch's loyalty, a mother's ambition, these could reshape history. This wasn't a peaceful sanctuary, it was a pressure cooker. A place where only one woman could become the mother of the next sultan, and her rise meant the downfall of every other contender. New arrivals entered as slaves chosen for beauty, intellect, or artistic ability. Some were trained to sing, others to dance, others were taught poetry or calligraphy. They were groomed like pieces on a chessboard, and behind every polite smile, competition simmered. Pregnancy was the ultimate turning point. One child could lift a nameless girl to unimaginable power, and everyone knew it. That's why rumors of poisonings, hidden miscarriages, and secret plots traveling through kitchens and corridors were never dismissed as legend. They were part of survival. Because inside this world, one truth ruled everything. Only one woman's son could sit on the throne, and everyone else was in her way. At the center of this entire power game stood the valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was the only woman who could stare down Grand Viziers and issue commands that shaped the empire. Some, like Concubines Sultan, built sprawling networks that reached foreign envoys, military commanders, and the most elite eunuchs. Others lost themselves to the pressure, swallowed by the very palace that elevated them, and the eunuchs. They weren't neutral observers, they were the harem's information brokers. They controlled letters, sealed doors, monitored every whisper, and fed the Sultan whatever version of the truth they wanted him to hear. With a single concealed message or a strategically timed favor, they could make or destroy a prince. The Kursler, Asha, the chief black eunuch, became one of Istanbul's shadow rulers, able to form alliances or dismantle them with a word. This made the harem a place where luxury was nothing but camouflage. Behind crystal lamps and marble floors lived a constant tug-of-war. Beauty was a tool. Silence was a weapon. A harmless smile might hide a conspiracy. A small mistake could be fatal. Yet not everything was pure darkness. A handful of women figured out how to use that prison as a ladder into history. Hurrem Sultan, wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, shattered centuries of custom by rising from concubine to legal queen. From her chamber, she funded public works, backed mosques, supported charities, and became one of the most influential figures of her era. After her came Concubines Sultan, who turned the Sultanate of Women into political reality, ruling indirectly through sons and grandsons for decades. But every female victory carried its own tragedy. For one mother to rise, another had to be destroyed. And in an empire where succession meant danger, brothers became rivals destined for death. When a sultan died, the new ruler often ordered the execution of his own brothers, strangled in silk, the empire's most brutal ritual, all to prevent rebellion. This wasn't just harem drama, it shaped the politics of the entire state. Meanwhile, the public observed from a distance. Istanbul's markets and coffee houses were alive with gossip. Who controlled the sultan? Which prince was favoured? What scandal toppled a vizier? The city lived between two realities: the noisy streets and the palace interior, where power changed hands in perfumed rooms stained by invisible blood. Tension built with every generation. The system, originally designed to stabilize the dynasty, slowly became a machine that consumed lives and maintained fear. The more authority concentrated inside the palace, the more fragile the empire became. And that web of secrets, rivalries, and betrayals finally erupted during one of the darkest chapters of Ottoman history. The century neared its end, and the empire entered an age where silk could no longer hide steel. Sitting on the throne was Ibrahim the Mad. His reign was a storm of excess, paranoia, and unstable impulses that dragged the empire toward disaster. Locked in the cafes, the golden cage, where princes were isolated to prevent plots. Since childhood, Ibrahim emerged psychologically broken. Years of confinement had twisted him. He trusted no one, feared everything, and followed his impulses without restraint. And the place where his instability played out most brutally was the harem. European chroniclers claim that in one violent outburst, Ibrahim ordered nearly 300 concubines executed, accusing them of betrayal. They were hauled to the freezing Bosphorus and thrown in alive. The water turned into a silent grave, eunuchs carrying out the massacre without hesitation. Whether exaggerated or not, the story lasted because it reflected the system's core truth. Absolute authority could wipe out hundreds of women in a single night. During these years, Concubines Sultan's presence loomed over everything. A powerful matriarch who had survived husbands, sons, and entire political factions. She was a symbol of both protection and fear, managing the fragile balance between eunuchs, viziers, and military groups. But even she couldn't fully stop Ibrahim's chaos. The harem turned into a battlefield. Concubines fought to secure their children's futures, eunuchs traded secrets like currency, and foreign ambassadors bore influence with gold-filled chests. Suspicion poisoned the air. Every move was read as a potential betrayal. Ibrahim spiraled further. Stories say he forced concubines to march in bizarre outfits, obsessed over scents and fabrics, and confused affection with brutality. Under his rule, the palace stopped functioning as a government and became a stage for grotesque theatre. Extravagance mixed with fear. Laughter blurred into panic. The public heard the echoes. Istanbul's streets buzzed with reports of a ruler who had lost control, uncles fattening themselves on stolen wealth, and women disappearing from the palace. Military failures abroad matched the disorder inside, as if the empire itself was unraveling. The breaking point came when the Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, had had enough. They revolted against the palace's chaos. Ibrahim was removed from the throne and soon after strangled by the very men sworn to defend him. And in that moment, the harem revealed exactly what it had always been, not a sanctuary, but the heart of a system where silence, ambition, and fear ruled over life itself. The harem wasn't just a prison for women, it was a graveyard for sultans. Kursem, the empire's most formidable matriarch, tried to hold on to power after her son fell. For a short time, she ruled as regent for her young grandson, Mehmed IV. But the cycle of violence consumed everyone eventually. Years later, she was strangled in her own chamber, killed with the same silk cord she had once ordered used against countless rivals and princes. What happened in the Imperial Harem wasn't one isolated tragedy, it was the final eruption of centuries of pressure. Blood in the Bosphorus, muffled screams behind Topkapi's stone walls, power games unfolding in rooms heavy with perfume, it all signaled a breaking point. The very system designed to stabilize the dynasty had mutated into a creature that devoured its own architects. After Ibrahim's execution and Kursem's assassination, Topkapi fell into an unnatural silence, as if the stones themselves were tired of absorbing conspiracies and cries. The harem, once the empire's center of influence, now showed the full cost of its decay. The throne shifted to Mehmed IV, barely a child. His innocence turned the palace into an open battlefield for competing factions. Eunuchs, viziers, and royal relatives scrambled to control every decision. The young sultan became a pawn in a game he couldn't understand. The harem, intended to protect dynastic continuity, had become an abyss that drained the empire from within. After Kursem's fall, the concubines lost nearly all their influence. Many were shipped to the old palace, another gilded cage where they spent the rest of their lives in quiet obscurity. Women who once shaped imperial politics were reduced to spectral figures, wandering lonely corridors, reminiscing about intrigues that no longer mattered. Silence became their final punishment. The eunuchs, meanwhile, reached new heights of authority. As the only link between the harem and the imperial court, they controlled information, and with it, the sultan's decisions. Some grew rich on bribes and secret deals. Others manipulated vizier appointments or negotiated quietly with European envoys. While the empire weakened, the true power flowed through whispers spoken behind wooden screens. Outside palace walls, defeat after defeat hammered the Ottoman military. Vienna's walls held firm against Ottoman armies, and borders began to shrink. Chroniclers saw these losses as reflections of the palace itself, a fractured empire trapped in endless internal feuds, more focused on palace plots than protecting its territories. Istanbul mirrored the same contradiction. The people endured starvation, plague, and war, while the palace lit crystal chandeliers and hosted lavish feasts. The chasm between the empire's rulers and its suffering population deepened resentment. Songs, gossip, and underground pamphlets voiced a growing bitterness. The harem was no longer a symbol of stability. It had become a metaphor for collapse. What once produced heirs and alliances had transformed into a machine that consumed wealth, lives, and hope. Every new sultan inherited not just a throne, but generations of corruption, fear, and paranoia. Princes raised in the cafes, the golden cage, grew up with no friends, no freedom, and no understanding of the world. Many ascended the throne with minds warped by solitude. Others were murdered before ever stepping outside their locked quarters. Those who survived lived balancing nostalgia for the empire's old glory with the constant fear of losing everything. The cost of this decay was measured not just in political instability, but in human suffering. Behind the big names, Ibrahim, Kursem, Mehmed, were hundreds of forgotten lives. Concubines who died in silence. Eunuchs sacrificed to politics, servants erased from history. The entire system, polished on the outside, functioned as a factory of pain. The harem, created to preserve imperial power, ultimately became its moral undoing. And with each generation, the cracks in Topkapi's walls widened, as if the palace itself sensed the slow collapse of its former splendor. Today, the imperial harem no longer exists. Its rooms are museum halls, its latticed windows, display pieces. But the real legacy of that world of silk and blood isn't found in artifacts, it's found in what can't be seen. For centuries, the harem shaped the minds of the sultans. Princes raised in isolation learned suspicion before leadership. Many reached the throne mentally shattered, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. This paranoia became policy, accelerating the empire's decline. Valid sultans left behind another conflicted inheritance. They proved that women could dominate viziers and armies, but only through a system built on trauma. Every mother who ruled did so, while other children were strangled, exiled, or erased. Over time, the harem became something the empire itself didn't want to face, an uncomfortable mirror that reflected everything it wanted to deny. For 19th century European travelers, it became the perfect symbol of Oriental decadence, a stereotype they weaponized to justify their prejudices and colonial ambitions. They turned the harem into a fantasy, women lounging on cushions, eroticized, exotic, and powerless. They didn't care about the truth. They wanted a story that confirmed their bias. But for 20th century Turks trying to build a modern nation, the harem was a stain from the past they wished would disappear. They hid it behind textbooks, silence, and national pride. Yet silence never erases anything, it only buries it deeper. The real legacy of the harem lies not in the glamorous tales or the legends about beauty and seduction, but in the voices that never got the chance to speak. In the women who never received names, in the children forgotten before their first birthday, in the stifled tears that dissolved into palace walls. Luxurious objects survived, jewels, fabrics, gilded rooms, but the human beings who lived and died inside those walls were swallowed by shadows, and that is the darkest inheritance of all, the normalization of suffering as part of the machinery of power. Walk through the corridors of Topkapi today, and you'll see tourists photographing mosaics and courtyards. But if you pause, if you let the silence settle for a moment, it almost feels like the walls still whisper. A faint echo of footsteps, a breath of fear, a memory of lives controlled by silence. Because in the harem, absolute power didn't need armies, it didn't need swords. Silence alone was enough to keep everyone in line. And that silence spread like a curse through the entire empire. The harem no longer rules. Its chambers have turned into museum wings, its windows into exhibits. But its true legacy endures as a warning. A reminder that even the greatest empires can feed on anonymous bodies, that politics can disguise itself as affection, that ambition can consume entire bloodlines. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: what is hidden behind gilded walls never stays hidden forever. The domes of Topkapi still shine beneath the Istanbul sun. People stroll through its gardens, admire the fountains, pose beside its displays, unaware that beneath those stones, countless acts of manipulation, coercion, and silenced intimacy once took place. The harem was not a sanctuary of pleasure. It was a laboratory of power where sex, loyalty, and violence intertwined so deeply that one could not exist without the others. Women were not only chosen for beauty, they were judged for their potential strategic value, their ability to charm, obey, produce heirs, and navigate a hierarchy where a single misstep meant ruin. Some concubines were forced to undergo humiliating purity examinations before entering the sultan's chambers. Others were trained relentlessly in seduction, dance, poetry, and etiquette, skills weaponized to keep the sultan's attention because his favor meant life, while his indifference could mean disappearance. There were nights when dozens of women waited, trembling to see who the sultan would summon. Some prayed to be chosen, knowing it gave them status. Others prayed not to be chosen, fearing what awaited them in the dark. European envoys wrote about concubines forced to parade before the ruler, judged like objects. Some were rejected on the spot. Others were singled out, not for affection, but to satisfy a whim, a mood, or a passing fantasy. The harem was built on the illusion of intimacy, but everything inside it was transactional. Behind the scenes, eunuchs controlled the movement of every woman. They dictated who slept where, who saw the sultan, who rose in rank, and who was quietly erased. Concubines who failed to impress could be retired to the old palace, where they spent decades in isolation. Some tried to form alliances with eunuchs, trading secrets, loyalty, or small favors in desperate bids to stay alive. And beneath all the luxury, something darker always simmered, the constant threat of sexual coercion disguised as royal privilege. The hierarchy itself revolved around intimacy. Who had access to the sultan's bed, who bore his children, who lost his attention, who plotted to regain it. This wasn't love, it was survival. Today, centuries later, these absences, the missing names, the unwritten stories, the lives turned into currency, still challenge us. How many voices were silenced to maintain the empire's image? How many bodies were used as bargaining chips in political games? How many women learned to smile while planning ways to avoid the sultan's chambers for one more night? Remembering the harem is not some academic exercise. It is an act of justice for the thousands reduced to shadows. Because the harem also warns us of something bigger. When power is locked away behind impenetrable walls, suffering becomes normal. Abuse becomes invisible, and exploitation becomes tradition. The past cannot be rewritten, but it can be told. Every time we talk about it, another layer of silence cracks. Every retelling lifts another forgotten life out of the dark. Topkapi's domes stand unchanged, but we no longer look at them the same way once we understand what they concealed. Now the question shifts to you. What do you think of this legacy? Do you believe that the silence of the harem still repeats itself in other forms of power today? Share your thoughts below and share this video, because history only stops being dark when someone finally decides to expose it.